I still remember the exact moment I realized how far the HOA would go, how far one woman, filled with the need to control her neighbors, would push a grieving family into the depths of despair, how one petty action could uproot so many emotions at once. It happened on a Tuesday, the day we laid my brother Jacob to rest. No one expected the quiet ceremony at our father's orchard to end with the jarring sight of my brother's funeral car being lifted onto a tow truck. Yet there it was, happening in broad daylight, courtesy of our HOA president, Cassandra Collins. I stood there, hands trembling, my heart pounding so loudly that I could hardly hear my own thoughts. I could only see the black sedan, filled with keepsakes and flowers, being taken away like it was some abandoned wreck. Jacob died 3 weeks prior in a tragic road accident. The aftermath left me shattered. My parents were inconsolable, especially my father, whose health was already declining. The orchard had been Jacob's favorite place since we were kids. He used to climb the ancient willow trees, carve our initials into the bark, and dream up big projects for the land someday. When he passed, we decided on a small, private service right where he'd spent so much of his childhood. The land was part of our family's heritage, passed down from my grandfather, even before there was a suburb, even before the HOA was formed. The orchard existed long before uniform fences and petty regulations took over. It was ours, legally and spiritually. We scheduled a modest gathering. A few relatives, friends, and neighbors who knew Jacob well joined us to say goodbye. The funeral car, an older model that my brother cherished, had been decorated with ribbons and photos of our happiest memories. It also held a few personal items, including a small wooden box containing notes of remembrance from those who loved him. We parked it under the shade of a large oak tree. That was supposed to be a final tribute to him, a way of honoring everything he loved, family, nature, and quiet reflection. But Cassandra, the HOA president, seized that moment to make her presence known. I recall the early morning hush before the ceremony began. The sun peeked through leafy branches, and dappled light fell on the orchard grass. Everyone was subdued, still carrying the raw ache of Jacob's absence. My father clutched his cane, swaying a bit from both sadness and declining health. My mother tried to straighten his collar, but her hands shook. I took a deep breath, determined to hold the family together, just long enough to give Jacob a meaningful farewell. We had a small arrangement of bouquets, a simple casket wreath, and a folding table with refreshments for anyone who felt faint in the summer heat. We started the eulogy with quiet words. I read a passage from Jacob's favorite book, pausing at intervals to catch my breath. My voice cracked more than once. I could sense tears forming at the corners of my eyes. No matter how I tried to maintain composure, the grief was too fresh. My mother sobbed softly, leaning into my father. Our relatives murmured condolences, dabbed at their cheeks with tissues, and occasionally bowed their heads in prayer. Through the orchard's rustling leaves, we heard the distant hum of a motor and the telltale beep of a truck reversing. It sounded out of place, so jarringly mechanical amidst such natural serenity. Then I saw her, Cassandra, stepping out of her pristine SUV wearing a pressed suit and an air of self-importance. She spotted us near the orchard's edge, glared at our gathering, and marched forward. Before I had a chance to intercept, she waved her phone in the air, ranting about unauthorized vehicles and unapproved ceremonies. I tried to explain that this land was privately owned by my family, that we had every legal right to hold a small funeral here. Her voice rose louder, echoing through the trees, as she insisted that the orchard fell under the HOA's jurisdiction because it bordered the communal walkway. My father, trembling, tried to clarify that our land was exempt from the HOA covenant, registered decades ago, well before the housing association was established. Cassandra wouldn't hear it. She took one look at the funeral car, decked in flowers and personal mementos, and declared it to be a public eyesore. She claimed it violated some obscure part of the HOA guidelines regarding vehicle aesthetics. Her face was flushed with a strange mix of anger and triumph, as though she had discovered a major infraction. That's when she snapped her fingers, pointing toward the car like she was indicting a criminal. Within minutes, a large tow truck rumbled in from the side road. Our guests stood in shock, uncertain how to react. My mother tried to approach the driver, pleading with him not to disrupt a funeral. The man shrugged. He had orders from the HOA, specifically from Cassandra. And so, as tears streamed down my mother's face, we watched the tow truck's winch engage. We saw the cables tighten around the funeral car. I felt my blood boil. My father stumbled forward, demanding that they stop. But Cassandra brandished a piece of paper she claimed was a formal HOA violation notice. She insisted we pay a hefty fine and remove the vehicle from the orchard, or else face legal action. None of her claims had any real legal basis, but in that moment we were too stunned by grief to fight effectively. The car, with all of Jacob's precious items, was lifted onto the truck bed as if it were junk. The driver secured it, slammed the side panel, and drove off, leaving behind a plume of dust and a swirl of confusion. I tried to chase after them, yelling that this was private property, that the orchard was not under HOA control. Cassandra smirked and informed me that if I continued to resist, she'd call the police for trespassing on so-called community grounds. The funeral ground to a halt. Our relatives and friends stood dumbfounded, some outraged, others too saddened to speak. My father's cane wobbled in his grip. My mother collapsed into tears on a nearby bench. That was the moment I vowed we wouldn't let this pass. I promised myself we would fight back. The question was, how? My immediate instinct was to run to a lawyer, but we still had a funeral to complete. Jacob's casket lay waiting under the oak tree, and the final prayers were yet to be said, so we pushed forward with the ceremony as best we could. People whispered among themselves, glancing over to see if Cassandra would interrupt again. But apparently, towing the funeral car was enough of a victory for her that day. She marched back toward her SUV with the same smug expression, leaving us to mourn in disarray. Even the orchard's gentle breeze couldn't dispel the heaviness of betrayal we felt at that moment. Once the service concluded and Jacob was laid to rest, I took my father home and made sure he was stable. Then I drove downtown, heart pounding, to consult an attorney. Fortunately, I had a connection with a local law firm because of some previous work I'd done in community outreach. My hope was to find out what legal recourse we had against Cassandra and the HOA. As I sat in the firm's waiting room, my thoughts spun wildly. Every detail of that horrifying morning replayed in my mind. I clung to the notion that Cassandra had no right to take the car from private land, especially during a funeral. She must have known how heartless that action looked, but perhaps she just didn't care. Marisa, a sharp-eyed attorney known for her no-nonsense approach, greeted me with a sympathetic handshake. She'd heard rumors about our orchard dispute, but the towing of a funeral car was a new low, even for the most stringent HOAs. We spent the next hour going over property maps, the original orchard deed, and details about the local HOA regulations. She assured me that if the orchard was indeed outside the official boundaries of the HOA, Cassandra's actions were not only morally wrong, but likely illegal. We discussed the possibility of suing for emotional distress, among other claims, trespassing, conversion of property, or even an intentional infliction of emotional harm. Marisa explained that such cases could be challenging, but towing a funeral car in the midst of a memorial service gave us a strong foundation. She suggested we gather as much evidence as possible, photos of the orchard's boundary lines, testimonies from family members, recordings of Cassandra's threats if we had them, and a copy of the HOA's covenant. Each piece could build our case. I returned home that evening to find my mother asleep on the couch, still clutching the folded obituary page from the funeral program. My father was in his bedroom, gazing out the window toward the orchard. The day had taken a toll on both of them, especially after losing Jacob in such a tragic manner. Their exhaustion fueled my resolve. My father asked if there was any news, his voice trembling. I told him I'd found a lawyer who believed we had a strong case. He nodded, though the lines of worry on his face grew deeper. Determined to gather everything we needed, I spent the next few days meeting neighbors, collecting statements about Cassandra's tactics, and researching the HOA's formation. The stories I heard painted a clear picture of a woman who thrived on intimidation. One neighbor, Mr. Daniels, recounted how Cassandra fined him for planting the wrong species of flowers in his front yard. Another neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had been threatened with a lawsuit for hanging wind chimes that apparently made excessive noise. Several residents confided that they believed Cassandra was funneling HOA funds for her personal projects, unnecessary repairs, lavish landscaping in front of her house. But no one had dared to challenge her. My suspicion grew that Cassandra's power tripping was more than just personal vendettas. She seemed to act like she owned the entire subdivision, including pockets of private land that predated the HOA's establishment. Our orchard was a prime example of her inability to respect rightful boundaries. Yet she always couched her actions in official-looking letters or cited dubious sections of the bylaws that most people didn't bother to read. Many residents simply complied out of fear or confusion. As the funeral car still hadn't been returned, we faced a new problem. The towing company demanded a release fee, claiming they had a contract with the HOA. I refused to pay, explaining that the orchard was private property exempt from HOA oversight. The towing company manager threatened to send the car to auction if we didn't comply within a week. Frustrated, I relayed this threat to Marissa, who calmly said it only strengthened our case for intentional wrongdoing. If the orchard indeed lay outside the HOA's territory, we'd prove Cassandra had no right to order that tow, making the towing company complicit. The tension escalated when Cassandra posted a notice on our front gate stating that our orchard was under community design guidelines and the funeral was an unauthorized event that violated nuisance restrictions. She also demanded we remove Jacob's gravesite, implying we had illegally buried him there. The audacity left me speechless. The orchard, with or without the funeral, had always been recognized as a separate tract. My grandfather had made sure of it when subdivisions sprouted around us. But Cassandra likely assumed we'd be too grief-stricken or too intimidated to fight back. One afternoon, I drove to the municipal records office and retrieved everything I could about the orchard's legal status. The clerk was a friendly older gentleman who remembered how the orchard's boundary lines had caused confusion in the past. He helped me locate the original property deeds, which plainly indicated the orchard was not part of the HOA's official layout. Satisfied, I took copies to Marissa, who looked them over with an approving nod. We soon filed the initial complaint against Cassandra and the HOA, claiming trespass, improper seizure of personal property, and emotional distress. The last claim was especially pertinent to our case. Removing a funeral car in the middle of a memorial service was about as blatant a violation of decency as one could imagine. The day after we filed, Cassandra reacted by sending out a mass email to the entire neighborhood. She painted us as uncooperative troublemakers, accusing us of flouting community standards and bringing an unlicensed funeral procession onto HOA property. The email contained multiple references to protecting property values, a phrase she often used to justify her outlandish fines. Many neighbors were confused. Some forwarded the email to me, expressing sympathy and bewilderment. They wanted to avoid Cassandra's wrath themselves, but felt her actions had crossed a moral line. Meanwhile, the stress began affecting my mother's health. She had trouble sleeping, haunted by the image of that tow truck pulling away with Jacob's cherished car. My father's blood pressure rose and he seemed more frail by the day. I did my best to shield them from the daily drama, gathering documents, meeting with Marissa, and occasionally fielding phone calls from the towing company. Word spread around town that Cassandra might have overstepped her authority. A few neighbors even began discussing the possibility of removing her from the HOA presidency. In the midst of collecting evidence, we stumbled upon something bigger. An accountant friend of Marissa discovered potential discrepancies in the HOA's financial records, thousands of dollars unaccounted for. It led us to suspect that Cassandra was siphoning association funds for personal use, which explained her fervor in controlling every aspect of the neighborhood. If she maintained a tyrannical grip, fewer people would dare to question her. Our orchard case could expose not just a single tow truck incident, but a web of corruption that had gone unchecked. Still, we tried to keep our main focus on the funeral car. We wanted it returned and wanted Cassandra to face the consequences of her heartless stunt. On day 5, after the car was towed, I drove to the towing lot with a camera in hand. I recorded the vehicle's condition: flowers wilted, personal items scattered inside, the memorial ribbons torn. That footage would be crucial in demonstrating the emotional damage inflicted upon our family. The towing manager looked uneasy. He seemed reluctant to deal with us anymore. He admitted that Cassandra had called them directly, claiming to speak for the entire HOA. Marissa advised we escalate the matter by demanding the immediate release of the car, emphasizing it was private property seized under false pretenses. If they refused, we'd file an emergency injunction. The towing company's lawyers likely saw the looming trouble because a few days later, they abruptly contacted me to arrange the vehicle's return. No fees, no additional charges. We accepted, relieved to retrieve Jacob's car, but still determined to pursue the lawsuit. The damage had been done. Our entire grieving process was overshadowed by Cassandra's intimidation, and we refused to let it end there. When the HOA board scheduled a meeting, presumably under pressure from mounting complaints, Marissa encouraged me to attend. We needed to present our stance publicly. My father was too fragile to join, and my mother was still too shaken, so I went alone. The gathering took place in the local community center, rows of folding chairs filled with anxious neighbors, many of whom whispered among themselves about the funeral fiasco. Cassandra stood at the front, a curated smile plastered on her face. She wore a sleek blazer and carried a clipboard brimming with documents. She cleared her throat, then launched into a lecture about recent incidents involving unauthorized usage of community space. As soon as she mentioned the orchard, I stood up and introduced myself by name. I calmly stated that our orchard was not in fact community property. I held up the deeds, placing them on a small podium near the front of the room. Cassandra's expression shifted from a smug grin to a forced neutrality. She tried to interrupt, claiming I was out of order. Several neighbors groaned audibly, some even clapped quietly in my defense, as they too had grown weary of Cassandra's heavy-handed tactics. I recounted the tow truck incident, emphasizing that it disrupted my brother's funeral and inflicted emotional harm on my family. Gasps and murmurs spread across the room. A few people stood up in solidarity, sharing their own experiences of questionable fines or harassment. One neighbor described how Cassandra threatened to fine him for leaving his porch light on past midnight. Another recalled being chastised for planting ornamental shrubs 2 inches outside the mandated boundary line. It became clear this was no isolated incident. Cassandra tried to regain control of the meeting by rattling off random rules. She even pointed a finger at me, shouting that my presence there was a violation of the bylaws because I was speaking out of turn. That's when Marissa, who had quietly entered the room, stepped forward. She announced herself as legal counsel for my family and presented a succinct argument that not only was the orchard out of the HOA's jurisdiction, but Cassandra's towing directive was entirely unlawful. She reminded everyone of our pending lawsuit, specifically mentioning the claim for emotional distress. The tension in the air was electric. Cassandra's face reddened and she fumbled with the papers on her clipboard. She stammered something about property values again, but the crowd seemed more interested in hearing the truth about her tactics. A significant moment occurred when an older gentleman, Mr. Alton, who had served on the board years ago, revealed that he had resigned after suspecting financial improprieties. He cast a sharp glance at Cassandra and implied that she'd been diverting funds for her personal gain. More gasps followed. Cassandra tried to deny it, but you could see the concern etched on the faces of the other board members. Clearly, the seeds of doubt had been sown. With so many residents openly voicing discontent, Cassandra's power seemed to waver. Over the following week, rumors swirled around the neighborhood. Some suspected that Cassandra was planning a countersuit to intimidate us further, but no such legal action emerged. Instead, she doubled down on her accusations, posting a notice about illegal funeral gatherings on the HOA website. She threatened anyone who participated in or witnessed our orchard burial with fines and legal ramifications, though it was unclear what authority she had for such claims. The more she pressed, the more people turned against her. One quiet evening, I heard a knock on our front door. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, looking distraught. She hesitated at first, then confided that Cassandra's enforcers had slapped her with a staggering fine for excessive moisture usage, accusing her of overwatering her garden. She suspected it was retaliation for her supportive comments about my family's case. I asked if she had documentation, and she gave me a letter that read like a veiled threat. I thanked her for trusting me with it and assured her that Marissa would investigate. At that point, it was undeniable that Cassandra was using the HOA as her personal fiefdom, weaponizing petty rules to maintain control and punish dissent. My lawsuit had become a lightning rod for the neighborhood's simmering resentments. With more people stepping forward to share their experiences, Marissa began collecting statements that showcased a pattern of harassment. We suspected that if we dug deeper, we'd find a laundry list of irregularities in the HOA's finances. Indeed, that suspicion materialized into concrete evidence when an accountant friend traced several suspicious transfers from the HOA's account to a private business linked to Cassandra. As we expanded our investigation, I found myself torn. Part of me just wanted closure, an apology, a peaceful orchard where Jacob could rest undisturbed, and for my parents to heal. Another part of me felt compelled to expose Cassandra's entire scheme so that no other family would be treated so callously. The impetus behind that second motivation was strong. We had already endured the humiliation of having a funeral car towed during our final goodbye to Jacob. How many more people suffered in silence? Marissa filed an amended complaint in court, adding the new evidence of possible financial misconduct. We waited anxiously for the hearing date. Meanwhile, tensions rose throughout the community. Cassandra convened an emergency HOA meeting, presumably to quell the growing dissent. Residents told me they received a bizarre email from her accusing me of orchestrating a personal vendetta that threatened the harmony of the neighborhood. She insisted her actions were purely for community safety and protecting property values. The phrase had become her mantra, repeated ad nauseum. Despite my frustration, I knew better than to confront her directly without a legal framework. Instead, Marissa and I prepared meticulously for the upcoming hearing. We gathered sworn affidavits from neighbors, copies of suspicious financial records, and photographic evidence of the orchard boundaries, all in the hope of painting a comprehensive picture of how Cassandra abused her position. My father, though frail, offered a statement on how the towing incident affected his grief process. Reading it broke my heart. He recounted standing there, cane trembling, seeing the physical embodiment of Jacob's memory wrenched away on a tow truck. Eventually, the hearing day arrived. We stepped into the courthouse, tension palpable in the air. Cassandra arrived with her attorney, a stiff-looking man named Andrew who specialized in defending HOA boards. Several neighbors came to show support, some even offering to testify about Cassandra's pattern of harassment. We took our seats in the dimly lit courtroom, scanning the faces of the judge and clerk, hoping for a fair outcome. The judge first examined the orchard's deed. He frowned at Cassandra's repeated claims that we had violated community guidelines by holding an unauthorized funeral. When he realized that the orchard was indeed outside the HOA's jurisdiction, he paused, glancing over at Cassandra with evident disapproval. Her attorney attempted to pivot, suggesting the orchard's boundary lines were ambiguous, but Marissa countered with official records. The judge agreed that the orchard belonged to my family outright, free of any HOA restrictions. Next came the towing incident. Cassandra's attorney tried to justify it by alleging we had parked on a public walkway. Our photographic evidence showed no such walkway existed on orchard property. Then we presented statements from attendees of Jacob's funeral, detailing how the towing disrupted the service. The judge listened solemnly, his gaze sliding from the papers to Cassandra, whose face flushed deeper by the minute. Finally, we raised the emotional distress claim. My father had written a moving letter describing the heartbreak of losing his son, followed by the shock of having the funeral car towed. We submitted it as an exhibit. In a trembling voice, I explained that the car held items of sentimental value, some of Jacob's last personal effects. The judge nodded sympathetically, then turned to Cassandra's side. Andrew tried to dismiss it as unfortunate timing, but the judge's expression suggested he saw through the spin. In the back row, I could hear neighbors shifting, some whispering quietly. Then Marissa brought up the financial mismanagement. That wasn't the main focus of our lawsuit, but it demonstrated Cassandra's willingness to skirt lawful boundaries. We introduced the suspicious transaction records, prompting Cassandra's attorney to protest that it was outside the scope of the hearing. The judge allowed the evidence, noting it spoke to Cassandra's credibility. At that point, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a measured tone. He declared that the HOA had no authority to tow our funeral car from private land, labeling Cassandra's action egregious and callous. He also found her personally liable for committing an intentional tort, which gave weight to our emotional distress claim. The question of damages would be determined in a subsequent phase if Cassandra's attorney didn't settle beforehand. The judge cautioned that the financial mismanagement allegations could lead to separate legal proceedings. Cassandra looked stunned, and for a moment she tried to speak, but her attorney advised her to remain quiet. When the hearing ended, a hush fell over the courtroom. A few neighbors outside the door clapped gently, breathing sighs of relief that someone had stood up to Cassandra at last. The HOA would face a reckoning, not just for towing a funeral car, but for all the other questionable fines and scare tactics that had plagued the neighborhood. I felt an overwhelming sense of validation, though it was bittersweet. Nothing could bring back my brother. Still, it meant something to have an official ruling that Cassandra's action was out of line. A couple of weeks later, Cassandra attempted to negotiate a settlement to avoid a full trial on damages. After deliberation, we agreed to certain terms, including financial compensation for our family, a formal apology, and the immediate resignation of Cassandra from the HOA presidency. The association also had to enact new guidelines that prohibited unilateral towing without verifiable cause, ensuring no one else would endure what we had. Additionally, an independent audit was ordered to review the HOA's finances, which threatened to expose the depths of Cassandra's potential wrongdoing. Though final results of that audit remained pending, her reputation was in tatters. As for my parents, they finally experienced a sense of closure. We reclaimed the orchard's peace. A small plaque under the oak tree served as Jacob's memorial, free from intrusion or condemnation. My mother began planting rows of daisies, Jacob's favorite flower, while my father sat under the shade, stroking the bark of the oldest willow tree. He whispered that he could almost hear Jacob's laughter in the rustling leaves. Each passing day, the orchard healed a bit more, reflecting our gradual emotional recovery. The funeral car, restored to us at last, remained parked near the orchard's entrance. We cleaned and polished it, placing a small framed photo of Jacob on the dashboard. Sometimes I'd sit in the driver's seat, rereading the notes family and friends left for my brother. The smell of old leather mixed with a faint hint of lilies from the original floral arrangement. It was both comforting and heartbreaking. Neighbors began dropping by, offering condolences or just wanting to see how we were doing. Some of them overcame their fear to share stories about how Cassandra had tried to find them for the most ridiculous reasons. Others simply stood beside me, gazing quietly at the orchard, remarking on its beauty, acknowledging that it should never have been part of any power game. A few older residents recalled the orchard from decades ago, remembering the sweet tang of the apples and pears it once produced. What started as a single act of cruelty had grown into a catalyst for change. The board replaced Cassandra with a more open-minded group of volunteers. They vowed to work with homeowners, respect property boundaries, and focus on genuine community improvements. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that Cassandra faced additional legal troubles for alleged fraud within the HOA's coffers. I didn't relish her downfall. I mostly felt relief that no one else would have to endure her callous reign. In the weeks that followed, a sense of unity blossomed among neighbors who once barely spoke to one another. People gathered to help maintain the orchard, planting new saplings in memory of lost loved ones. A handful of them approached me, wondering if we might organize small community events there. I discussed it with my parents, and we agreed to host monthly open orchard afternoons, allowing children to run around safely and older folks to enjoy the shade. If anything, Jacob would have loved to see the orchard used to bring people together. On one of those afternoons, as we set up a few wooden benches, my father quietly rested a hand on my shoulder. His eyes glistened with tears. He thanked me for standing up for our family, for refusing to let grief silence us. I squeezed his hand in return. Words felt unnecessary in that moment. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying hints of apples in bloom. In the distance, I saw neighbors chatting amiably, free from the fear of arbitrary fines or petty rules. The orchard finally felt like it belonged to us again. No more hostility, no more outsiders with tow trucks and hollow authority. And so, in the end, our battle wasn't merely about retrieving a car or punishing one woman's overreach. It became a stand for the values Jacob held dear: community, empathy, and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Although we were never compensated for the raw pain and sorrow inflicted on us during that funeral, we did gain a sense of purpose, a renewed bond among those who once felt powerless. We discovered that a shared loss can bring people together, and in that unity lies a formidable defense against tyranny, whether it arrives disguised as an HOA bylaw or something far more insidious. I still visit Jacob's gravesite every week. The daisies my mother planted have multiplied, swaying gently each time the wind passes through. My father sits on a simple wooden chair, eyes half closed, letting the orchard's tranquility envelop him. Sometimes we speak of Jacob aloud, other times we remain silent. And though we'll always carry the grief of his absence, we've learned that there's a deep healing in claiming our space and ensuring that no one can rob us of our memories or degrade our sorrow for the sake of someone's inflated sense of power. Cassandra tried and failed because at the end of the day, empathy and unity overshadow any petty rule or intimidation tactic. That's our story. That's how my family found the strength to sue an HOA tyrant for emotional distress, and how we reclaimed the orchard that had cradled my brother's youth. We turned our heartbreak into action, transforming a painful moment into a collective stand for decency and love. And perhaps somewhere in the gentle rustle of the orchard leaves, my brother Jacob is smiling, proud that in our struggle, we found not just justice, but a shared promise to make our neighborhood a more compassionate place for everyone.